What would you do if the man you built everything with, 26 years of your life, your home, your reputation, your name, looked you in the eye and made you feel like the problem? What would you do if you found out his betrayal wasn't just in the bedroom, but in every spreadsheet, every account, every signature you trusted him with? And what would you do if the one phone call you made the morning after the worst night of your life turned out to be the most powerful thing you had ever done? My name is Sarah, and I want to tell you what happened when I stopped being the woman who stayed quiet and became the woman who finally made the call. Stay with me, because this one is going to surprise you. And before I go any further, if you're enjoying this story, hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and tell me where you're watching from. Just a reminder, this is a fictional dramatization for entertainment only. It's not professional legal, medical, or financial advice. Viewer discretion is advised. Enjoy the rest of the video. Greenwich, Connecticut is the kind of town that smells like old money and fresh paint. The lawns are manicured. The driveways are long and quiet. The cars are new enough to be impressive, but understated enough not to be crass. The women at the club smile with their teeth, but their eyes are always measuring you. Always running the numbers. How long have you been here? What does your husband do? Where are the kids in school? I had lived there for 22 years by the time everything fell apart, and I had spent most of those years learning how to smile the right way too. I met Mark Calloway when I was 28 years old and working in the accounting department of a mid-size commercial real estate firm in Stamford. He was 31. He was tall, confident, and he laughed at everything I said as if I were the funniest person he'd ever met. He had a plan for his life. That was the thing I noticed first. Most men I had dated floated. Mark moved with intention. We got married in the fall. Small ceremony, stone church, real maple leaves. The kind of wedding that photographs beautifully and cost more than either of us could afford at the time. His father, Arthur, paid for most of it. Arthur Calloway. I'll come back to him. We bought the house in Greenwich 3 years into the marriage, when Mark's career at the financial advisory firm had started to climb. It was more house than we needed then. 4 bedrooms, a half-acre lot, a back porch that faced west, so we caught the sunsets in summer. Mark said it was an investment. He said we were buying into a neighborhood, into a reputation, into the life we were going to build. And I believed him. I believed every word. What I didn't understand then, what took me years to see clearly, was that the house wasn't just an investment to Mark. It was a costume. It was the backdrop for a character he was performing, the successful man, the provider, the Greenwich husband. And my role in that performance was very specific. I was the devoted wife, the quiet one, the one who made the dinner parties feel warm and effortless, the one who managed the household accounts, raised our 2 children, volunteered on 3 school committees, and made sure Mark never had to think about anything smaller than his next deal. I had an accounting degree. I had worked for 6 years before we decided I would step back when our daughter was born. Stepping back, I was told, was a gift to our family, and I gave it freely. I did. At first, the years went by the way they do when you're busy and you love your children and you tell yourself the small frictions in a marriage are normal. The years went by, and I stopped counting what I had given up and started measuring time by the kids' school years, by the holidays, by the renovations we did to the kitchen in 2009 and the back deck in 2014. I was 51 years old when I found the texts. I want to be precise about this because it matters. I was not snooping. I was not suspicious in any dramatic way. I had noticed Mark was distracted. I had noticed he was going to the gym more often. I had noticed he was quieter at dinner and louder on the phone when he was outside by the garage. But I told myself these things were the normal static of a man under pressure at work. I told myself I was not the kind of woman who went through her husband's phone. And then, one Tuesday evening in October, he left his phone on the kitchen counter while he went to take a shower. The screen lit up with a message. I wasn't trying to read it. I was standing 3 feet away, reaching for my reading glasses, which I could never find, by the way, because I kept leaving them on top of the refrigerator. And I saw the first line of the message before the screen went dark. Can't wait to see you Friday. I've been thinking about you all week. It was from someone named Cass. I stood in that kitchen for what felt like a very long time. The dishwasher was running. The coffee from earlier was still warm in the pot. Everything around me was exactly the same as it had been 30 seconds ago, and I was completely different. I didn't touch the phone. I put my reading glasses on. I poured myself the last of the coffee. I went and sat at the kitchen table, and I waited for Mark to come back downstairs. He came in toweling off his hair. He was in a good mood. He poured himself a glass of water and said something about a show he wanted to watch later. I said nothing about the text. That was the first mistake I made, and I will tell you why. In a minute, it wasn't entirely a mistake. I couldn't sleep that night. I lay in the dark next to my husband of 23 years, and I listened to him breathe, and I ran through every version of what I might have seen. Maybe Cass was a colleague. Maybe it was a group message. Maybe there was context I was missing. I was very good, even then, at finding ways to make things make sense when I didn't want them to be true. By 3 in the morning, I had stopped trying to explain it away. By 4, I was thinking very clearly. I did not cry until I was in the shower the next morning with the water running loud enough to cover it. I stood there for a long time, and then I turned off the water, dried my face, and I got dressed. I remember the blouse I put on. It was navy, slightly wrinkled from the drawer. I didn't iron it. I didn't care. I sat at the edge of the bed for a moment with my hands in my lap. They were shaking a little. And then I picked up my phone. I did not call Mark. I did not call my sister. I did not call any of the women from the school committee, or the friends I saw at the club, or the neighbors who waved from their driveways. I called Arthur Calloway, my father-in-law. And that call, that one call on a Wednesday morning in October with a wrinkled navy blouse and shaking hands, was the beginning of the end of the life I had known. And also, though I didn't know it yet, the beginning of something else entirely. Arthur picked up on the second ring. Let me tell you about Arthur Calloway, because you need to understand him to understand what happened next. Arthur was 78 years old. He had built his money in commercial real estate and regional banking over 4 decades in Connecticut. He was not a warm man exactly. He was precise. He had a handshake that felt like a notary seal. He wore the same 3 suits on rotation, and he drove a car that was 12 years old because he said new cars were for people who needed to impress strangers. He had not always approved of me. When Mark first brought me home, Arthur looked at me the way he looked at every financial instrument, with careful, impersonal assessment. I was from a middle-class family in western Massachusetts. My father had been a high school principal. I had student loans when I met his son. Arthur considered that relevant information, but over the years, slowly, the way trust builds in Arthur's world, through small proofs rather than grand gestures, he had come to respect me. He had watched me run the household with precision. He had seen me handle the family finances with accuracy and no waste. He had watched me, twice, catch errors in Mark's business accounting that Mark had missed. He didn't say much about any of it, but Arthur Calloway noticed things. We had a particular bond, he and I, that had nothing to do with warmth and everything to do with honesty. He was the one person in the Calloway world who told me the truth without softening it. When my mother-in-law was alive, and she would say things at holiday dinners designed to make me feel small, Arthur would look at her once, and she would stop. He did it without drama. He just looked at her. When I called him that Wednesday morning, I told him what I had seen. I told him exactly. No embellishment, no tears in my voice. I had already used all of those in the shower. I told him about the text, the name, the timing. I told him I hadn't confronted Mark yet. I told him I wasn't sure what I was going to do. There was a pause on the line. Arthur was not a man who filled silence with reassurance. Then he said, "Come have coffee with me this morning. Don't say anything to Mark until we talk." That was all. I drove to his house, a large, old colonial about 2 miles away, the kind of house that had been beautiful once and was now simply imposing. And I sat at his kitchen table, and he poured me coffee, and he looked at me very steadily and said, "How much do you know about the firm's current financial structure?" I told him what I knew, which was some but not all. Mark handled the business. I handled the household. That was the arrangement. Arthur nodded slowly. He got up and went to a drawer in the kitchen, a junk drawer, the kind every house has, full of batteries and rubber bands and old takeout menus, and he pulled out a manila envelope. He had been carrying it in that drawer, he told me, for about 4 months. He set it on the table between us. "I think," Arthur said, "you should read this before you do anything else. I want to be careful about how I describe what was in that envelope, because what came next was not simple, and the details matter. What I found inside was a partial copy of the partnership restructuring documents from Mark's firm, a limited liability company that Mark co-owned with two other partners, and tucked inside those pages was a single letter, written on firm letterhead, dated the previous spring, addressed to Arthur himself. In it, Mark had proposed, in careful legal language, the transfer of a significant piece of equity, specifically a trust that Arthur had established years ago, jointly designated for both Mark and me, entirely into Mark's sole name, as a condition of a new internal partnership vote. Arthur had not signed it. He had not agreed to it. He had not told Mark he received it. He had put it in the kitchen drawer and waited. I read it twice. The coffee cooled. The morning light shifted. I could hear the grandfather clock in the hallway ticking. "He doesn't know I kept that," Arthur said. I looked up at him. "He was counting on you not knowing any of this," Arthur said. "And he was counting on you being too proud to come to me." And that was when I understood. This wasn't just a betrayal in the bedroom. That was the personal wound, the one that would take years to fully heal. But there was something else happening underneath it, something structural, something financial. And it had been in motion for months before I found any text on any phone. I had 30 days before a critical filing deadline connected to the firm's internal restructuring. Arthur told me that quietly, over the rim of his coffee cup. 30 days. I drove home very carefully. I did not confront Mark that day. I know that sounds strange. I know most people would have walked in the door and started talking or crying or throwing things. I am not most people. Or maybe I was just running on the kind of cold clarity that comes after a long night without sleep and a morning with Arthur Calloway. I went home, made lunch for myself that I didn't eat, and spent the afternoon on the phone with someone I hadn't spoken to in a long time. Her name was Diane. She had been my roommate in college, and she had gone on to become a family law attorney in New Haven. We had stayed loosely in touch, birthday texts, the occasional coffee when the planets aligned. I had not called her with anything serious in many years. I called her now. Diane answered on the fourth ring, and when she heard my voice she said, "Sarah, are you okay?" I told her I was fine, and then I told her I wasn't. She listened for a long time without interrupting. That was the thing I had always loved about Diane. She had the kind of patience that made you feel heard rather than processed. When I was done, she said, "Don't sign anything. Don't move anything. Don't change anything. Document everything you have access to right now and come see me as soon as you can." She paused. "Also, don't confront him yet. I know that's hard. But wait, I almost didn't listen to that part. I almost called Mark downstairs that very evening and let it all come out at the kitchen table with the dishwasher running and the wrinkled blouse and everything. My hands shook. I almost didn't hold back. But I thought about Arthur's envelope. I thought about 30 days. I waited. That night, I sat across from my husband at dinner, and I watched him the way you watch someone when you are seeing them for the first time. Not with hatred. I want to be honest about that. With something more complicated than hatred. I watched him, and I thought about the man he had been at 31, full of plans and intention, and I tried to find him in the man across the table, and I couldn't quite do it. The distance between those two men was the distance of 23 years, and I was somewhere in that distance, and I wasn't sure yet how to find my way out. He asked me if I wanted more wine. I said, "No, thank you." He talked about a deal he was working on. I made the right sounds at the right intervals. I went to bed early and stared at the ceiling. The next morning, there was a certified letter in the mailbox. It was addressed to both of us, from a title and escrow company I didn't recognize. It regarded a property I did not know we owned. I opened it at the kitchen counter with my reading glasses on, and my heart very still. It was a notice of an upcoming closing, 14 days from the letter's date, on a condominium. The property was listed in Mark's name only. The address was in Westport. I took a photograph of the letter with my phone. I put it back in the envelope. I put the envelope in my coat pocket. I texted Diane before Mark came downstairs. I want to talk for a moment about how it feels to be gaslit in a life you have built with your own hands. Because when I finally did confront Mark, 4 days after the letter, a Thursday evening when the kids were both out of the house, our daughter visiting a college friend, our son at a work dinner in the city, it did not go the way I expected. I had the certified letter. I put it on the table in front of him. He looked at it, and then he looked at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. It was not guilt. It was irritation. "Where did you get that?" he said. "It came in the mail," I said. "Addressed to both of us." He picked it up. He set it back down. He rubbed the back of his neck, a thing he did when he was buying time. And then he said, "That's a business property. It's complicated. Tell me about it," I said. And then he said something that I replay sometimes in quiet moments, not because it hurt the most, but because it was the most revealing thing he ever said to me. He said, "Sarah, you've never understood the business side of things. That's not a criticism. It's just the reality. This is complicated in ways that are hard to explain." I had an accounting degree. I had kept the books on our household for 23 years. I had twice caught errors in his firm's financials that had saved him real money. And in that moment, sitting at the kitchen table in the house we had owned together for 19 years, my husband told me I had never understood the business side of things. I didn't raise my voice. I was surprised by how calm I felt. "Whose name is on the condo?" I said. "Mine, for now. It's part of a... Is Cass's name on it?" The room went very quiet. I had not planned to bring that in so soon. But it was out, and it sat there between us on the table next to the certified letter, and I watched my husband's face do several things in rapid succession: surprise, calculation, then something that looked almost like relief, which was perhaps the strangest of all. He said, "I don't know what you think you know. I know what I saw on your phone," I said, "and now I know about a property in Westport in your name alone. I'm not going to pretend that's nothing." He stood up from the table. He walked to the window and stood with his back to me, the way men do in movies when they're about to say something difficult, and I thought, even in that moment, that Mark had always had a talent for framing himself cinematically. "We've had problems for a long time," he said. "You know that." And there it was, the pivot, the moment when the conversation stops being about what he did and becomes about the state of the marriage, which is always conveniently shared, always mutual, always complicated. I stayed quiet. I had learned from Diane. Don't fill the silence for him. Cass and I, it's not what you're making it sound like. I'm not making it sound like anything," I said. "I'm asking you to explain a property closing in 2 weeks, in your name alone, on a condo I didn't know existed." He turned around, and now the expression on his face was the one I had seen more and more in recent years, the faint, patient condescension of a man who has decided his wife doesn't quite understand the world he operates in. "There are things in motion," he said. "Business things. I was going to talk to you about it." "When?" "When the time was right. The closing is in 11 days, Mark." He said nothing. "And the partnership restructuring at the firm," I said. "Were you going to talk to me about that too? Before or after you transferred the equity trust your father set up for both of us into your name alone?" That one landed. I saw it. His face changed in a way he couldn't control. A small tightening, a shift in the eyes. "How do you know about that?" he said quietly. "Because I'm not as uninformed as you counted on," I said. He sat back down slowly. He put both hands flat on the table. He looked at me with an expression I had not seen before. Not guilt exactly, but something closer to it than anything I'd gotten in years. A kind of recalibration. "We should talk about this with a mediator," he said. "Someone neutral. This is getting heated." "I'm not heated," I said. And I wasn't. I was the most frightening kind of calm. "I'm informed. The neighborhood outside was quiet in the way it gets on a Thursday evening. One of our neighbors was walking a dog down the street. A car moved slowly past. Everything was exactly as it always was, and nothing was the same." I excused myself and went upstairs. I sat on the edge of the bed, our bed, the bed I had slept in for 19 years, and I held my phone and texted Diane. "He knows I know." He tried to pivot, holding the line. "What's next?" She texted back within minutes. "Good. Make no decisions. Protect access to your documents. Come in tomorrow." And then, 3 minutes later, a second text from her. "Also, do not leave the house. Don't go anywhere. You have more rights there than you think. Stay put." I set the phone on the nightstand. The grandfather clock in the hallway, we'd inherited it from Mark's mother, ticked steadily. I had always loved that clock. I had polished it every spring. I stared at it for a while. And then something Diane had said months ago, long before any of this, at one of those occasional coffees we'd managed to have, came back to me. We'd been talking about nothing in particular, just catching up, and she'd mentioned a case she was working on, not by name, vaguely, the way attorneys do, about a woman who had stayed in a difficult marriage too long, and she'd said something that I'd filed away in that drawer in the mind where you keep things you're not ready to think about. She said, "The The saddest cases I see aren't the ones where women lose in court. They're the ones where women win in court, but they waited so long that the assets were already gone. I had smiled and changed the subject that day. I was not smiling now. Diane's office was in a converted Victorian on a side street in New Haven, the kind of building that feels serious and a little worn at the edges, which I had always found reassuring. Law should look like it's been used. I brought everything I had, the photograph of the certified letter, the documents from Arthur's envelope, a year's worth of household account statements I had printed quietly at the library on my way over, a notebook where I had written down in my small, careful handwriting everything I could remember about the past 6 months, the gym trips, the late nights, the muffled phone calls, the dates, the names, the amounts. Diane sat across from me with her reading glasses on and went through it all without saying anything for a long time. She made notes on a yellow legal pad. She turned pages carefully. Her office smelled like strong coffee and old paper. Finally, she looked up. "Okay," she said. "Here's what I see." She walked me through it in plain language, which I was grateful for. The condominium in Westport, listed in Mark's name alone, purchased 6 months ago using proceeds from a business account that both of us were technically on as a married couple, though I had never been shown those transactions. The equity trust. Arthur's document showed an attempt to consolidate assets in a way that would have significantly reduced what I was entitled to claim in any future proceedings. The firm's restructuring, a timing that was not coincidental, designed to shift certain income-generating assets into a new partnership structure before any formal separation could establish a baseline. He was planning this, I said, not as a question. "It looks like it's been in motion for a while," Diane said carefully. She was not the kind of person who editorialized. "What's clear is that there are multiple financial moves that would have materially affected your position if they had been completed before you became aware of them. What do I do?" "First," she said, "we file a notice. Today, if possible. It puts the marital estate on record, which means any transfer or sale that happens from this point on is trackable and contestable. And the condo closing? That's in 10 days. We can petition to freeze that transaction pending review of marital assets." She paused. "That will not be a quiet process, Sarah." I understood what she meant. In Greenwich, in the circles we moved in, nothing stayed private for long. A legal filing, a frozen transaction, a court petition. Word moved through that town like water through limestone, fast and invisible until it came up somewhere you didn't expect. "His partners will find out," I said. "Yes, the people at the club will find out. Probably." I looked at the yellow legal pad with her notes. I thought about the way our neighbors waved from their driveways. I thought about the women at the school committee and the charity gala we attended every spring. I thought about Mark's face at dinner parties, relaxed, confident, the man everyone liked talking to. I thought about the woman who had been thinking about him all week. "File it," I said. Diane nodded and picked up her pen. Walking out of her office an hour later, into the cold October air, I felt something I couldn't quite name at first. Not relief, not anger anymore. Something quieter and more permanent, like the moment a ship's anchor finally catches and holds. My phone buzzed. It was Mark. "Where are you?" his text said. I held the phone for a moment, standing on the sidewalk in front of the Victorian, watching leaves blow across the street. "Running errands," I texted back, and I got in my car. The next 48 hours were the kind that compress time. You remember them in flashes, not in sequence. I remember sitting in the parking lot of the library, using the public printer, making 3 copies of everything. I remember the smell of toner and the sound of the machine running. I remember going home and taking a long, careful walk through the house. Every room, every closet, every cabinet, not looking for anything dramatic, just looking, seeing it. 22 years of Sunday mornings and homework at the kitchen table, and Christmas trees by the bay window, and arguments about nothing important, and some arguments about things that mattered, and the smell of dinner, and the sound of children, and all of it, layered into the walls of a house that was now the center of a legal filing I had signed my name to that afternoon. I remember Mark coming home that evening and being very quiet, in a way that was different from his usual quiet. His phone was face down on the counter. He did not look at me with the patient condescension. He looked at me differently. He looked at me, I think for the first time in a long time, with something like attention. I asked him how his day was. He said fine. We moved around the kitchen the way people do when a conversation is happening underneath the one being spoken out loud. Before bed, he said quietly, "I got a call from my attorney today." I said, "Okay, Sarah." He said my name in the old way, the way he'd said it when I was 28, and he thought I was the funniest person he'd ever met. "I think we need to talk, really talk." "We will," I said, "through the appropriate channels." He stared at me. "Good night, Mark," I said, and I went upstairs. I was not as calm as I sounded. I want to be clear about that. I lay awake that night with my heart working too hard and my thoughts moving in circles. I thought about our daughter, who was 20 at her friend's apartment, not knowing any of this yet. I thought about our son, 23 and working in the city, starting his own life. I thought about what this was going to do to them, and that was the thing that finally made me cry. Not the texts, not the condo, not the equity transfer or the partnership restructuring or any of the financial instruments of betrayal. My kids. That was the thing that broke through. I cried for a while. Then I stopped. Then I made a mental list of everything I had done in the past week, and I was surprised by how much it was. I had not fallen apart. I had moved. I had gathered. I had been strategic and careful and clear. I had been, without planning to be, the person I apparently was underneath all those years of stepping back and smiling correctly and managing the background of someone else's foreground. That thought did not make me happy, exactly, but it made me something. Steadier, maybe. The status inversion happened faster than I expected, and it came from a direction I hadn't anticipated. Mark moved very quickly once he understood the legal filing was real. He contacted his attorney, a man named Gerald, whom I had met at firm events, all smooth edges and a money clip. And Gerald apparently advised Mark to begin a negotiation posture that would demonstrate reasonableness, which meant Mark, within the space of about a week, went from the confident, condescending man at the kitchen table to someone calling me twice a day and leaving messages that began with the word, "Look, look, Sarah. I think there's a way to handle this that's fair to everyone. Look, Sarah, I want you to know I'm willing to have an honest conversation. Look, Sarah, I understand you're upset." The word "look" told me everything I needed to know about those calls. It was the word of a man trying to reposition himself, to get in front of a narrative before someone else got there first. I did not return the calls. Diane had told me not to. What Mark had not counted on was Arthur. Arthur Calloway had, in his quiet and precise way, been making his own calculations since the morning I sat at his kitchen table and he slid that manila envelope across to me. He had not told Mark about our conversation. He had not told Mark about the letter he'd kept in the kitchen drawer. And now, with a legal filing in place and attorneys involved, Arthur did something that I don't think Mark ever in his life expected his father to do. Arthur contacted Diane's office directly. He offered to provide a sworn affidavit describing the equity transfer request, the letter Mark had sent him, unsolicited, asking him to consolidate the trust in Mark's name alone without my knowledge or consent. When Diane called to tell me, I sat down on the kitchen floor. Not dramatically, just, I sat down. My legs decided to stop holding me up for a moment. "His own father," I said. "His own father," Diane said. "Why?" I said, though I thought I knew. Diane was quiet for a moment. "He said, and I'm paraphrasing, that he built what he built over his lifetime to provide for his family. All of it, including you." I was quiet for a moment. "He also said something else," Diane added carefully. "He said that his son had confused being provided for with being entitled, and that was a lesson he apparently failed to teach him." I thought about Arthur at the head of the Thanksgiving table every year, precise and formal, cutting the turkey himself. I thought about the way he had looked at me across the kitchen that October morning, steady and assessing, and put the manila envelope on the table between us. He had been waiting, I realized. He had had that letter for 4 months, and he had been waiting to see what I would do. The firm's partners were, by this point, aware that something was happening. Legal filings have a way of becoming known. Gerald, Mark's attorney, had apparently communicated with the firm's general counsel. The partnership restructuring vote, originally scheduled for the following month, was quietly postponed pending clarification of the Calloway marital assets picture. That postponement cost Mark something significant in standing. He had been the one pushing for the restructuring. He had positioned himself within the firm as the driver of this new arrangement. The postponement made him look like a man whose private affairs were leaking into professional ones, which, to the other partners, was not a small thing. Mark's two partners, both careful, reputation-conscious men in their late 50s, began scheduling meetings he was not included in. I know this because one of their wives, a woman I had sat next to at a dozen charity events, called me on a Thursday morning, apparently on impulse, and said, "Sarah, I just want you to know, I've always thought you were the most together person in the room, and I'm sorry." She hung up before I could respond. I stared at my phone for a minute, and then I called Diane. There is a moment, in any long fight, when the ground shifts. You don't always feel it happening. Sometimes you only know it happened by what you find on the other side of it. My moment happened at a meeting I didn't know I was going to until the morning of. Diane called at 7:30 on a Monday and said, "Can you be in my office by 9? Gerald has requested a four-way with both clients present. Mark wants to make an offer." I said yes. I made myself a piece of toast I didn't eat, drove to New Haven with the radio off, and sat down in Diane's conference room. A long table, a window that looked onto the side street, afternoon light the color of weak tea. Mark was already there when I arrived. He was in a suit, which was unusual for a Monday, and he had the careful, composed expression of someone who had been coached. Gerald sat beside him, money clip energy in full effect, silver at the temples. Mark looked at me. I looked at him. The negotiation that followed was 2 hours long, and I am going to compress it because the specific legal mechanics are less important than what happened underneath them. The short version: Mark proposed a settlement that would give me the house, a substantial cash payment, and a share of the marital estate, as calculated without the firm's new partnership structure, meaning the equity that had not yet been transferred, the accounts in both names, and a portion of the trust Arthur had established. It was, on its surface, a reasonable offer, but Diane had prepared me. She had walked me through, the week before, what reasonable looked like on paper versus what was actually fair. She had shown me the numbers side by side. She had shown me what the household would have been worth in terms of investment and labor and foregone career income, if calculated honestly. She had been calm and precise and slightly ruthless about it, which I had needed. I did not take the first offer. Gerald looked surprised. Mark looked surprised in a different way. A flicker of the old condescension, quickly suppressed. Diane countered. Gerald responded. Back and forth, the way these things go, with legal language that was really just the formal version of what we were all doing, negotiating what my 23 years were worth. At one point during a recess, Mark and I ended up in the hallway outside the conference room at the same time. Gerald and Diane were both in the room. Just the two of us in a carpeted hallway with fluorescent light overhead and the sound of a copier somewhere. Mark looked at me and said, quietly, "I didn't plan for it to be like this." I thought about that for a moment. "No," I said, "you planned for it to be quiet. That's different." He looked down at his shoes. He had always had good shoes. "Arthur's affidavit," he said. I didn't think he would." "I know," I said. "That's his right," Mark said. And there was something in his voice then. Not self-pity, but something sadder than that. A recognition, maybe, of a distance between himself and his father that had opened a long time before any of this. "It's his right." We went back into the conference room. The hearing was in 2 weeks when the second problem arrived, and this one came from a direction I had not seen at all. The condo in Westport. Diane's petition had frozen the closing, yes. But what came out of that freeze, when the title company was required to disclose the full transaction record, was something no one in that conference room had discussed yet. The condo had been purchased using funds from 2 sources, a business account in Mark's name and a personal loan. The personal loan, a sizable one, had been taken against the equity line on our Greenwich home. Our home. The home that was, under the terms of the settlement we were negotiating, going to me. Which meant that if the loan was not repaid, it became my problem. When Diane found this, she called me on a Friday afternoon. I was at the grocery store. I walked out of the grocery store without my cart and stood in the parking lot in the cold with my phone pressed to my ear while she explained it. "He borrowed against the house equity," I said. "It was an equity line of credit. It was in both names. He was entitled to access it, and he used it to buy a condo for someone else. Functionally, yes." Diane's voice was steady. "Here's the thing, Sarah. This actually helps us. It establishes a clear financial harm, marital funds used for a relationship outside the marriage. We can make a very strong argument in front of a judge." "How much?" She told me the amount. I stood in the parking lot and watched a seagull land on a light post and stare at me. "So the house I'm keeping," I said, "has a lien on it, for now. And that lien is going to be part of the final settlement." "Yes, and we're going to make sure it's addressed before you sign anything." I said nothing for a moment. A woman walked past me with a full cart and looked at me with the polite non-expression of someone who has decided not to notice that another person is having a difficult phone call in a parking lot. "Diane," I said, "can we get him to cover the lien as part of the settlement?" "That's exactly what I intend to argue," she said. I got back in my car. I sat there for a moment with the keys in my hand. Outside, the parking lot was gray and ordinary. A man was loading groceries into a minivan. A woman was arguing with a shopping cart about which direction she wanted it to go. The world was relentlessly, stubbornly, comfortingly ordinary. My phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. I opened it. It read, "I know who you are. Mark told me about you. I'm not trying to cause more problems. I just want you to know I didn't know he was still married in the real sense. I'm sorry." I stared at it for a long time. Then I put the phone face down on the passenger seat, started the car, and drove home. There is a version of this story where I crumble at that point, where the text from Cass breaks through all the careful legal strategy and the cool mornings with Arthur and the quiet confidence I had been building, and I fall apart. And I would not have blamed that version of myself. I would have understood her completely, but I didn't crumble. I went home. I made dinner. I sat at the kitchen table alone. Mark had moved to a hotel by then, voluntarily, under some quiet advice from Gerald about optics. And I ate what I had made, and I washed my dishes, and I stood at the window over the sink looking out at the backyard in the dark. There was a maple tree back there, a big one, that we had planted the year after we moved in. It was barely a sapling then. It was a real tree now. It had survived 2 hurricanes and an ice storm and 19 Connecticut winters, and it was standing there in the dark without any apparent concern for what was happening inside the house. I thought about foreshadowing, if you can believe that. I thought about all the small things I had noticed over the years and filed away and not examined. The way Mark had started referring to the house as the Greenwich property in conversation, as if it were an asset rather than a home. The way he had, gradually, moved my name off the firm's quarterly statements that used to arrive at the house. I had assumed it was just a mailing list change. The way he had, twice in the past year, mentioned casually that it might be worth thinking about whether we wanted to simplify the financial picture as we got older. Simplify. I had thought he meant less clutter, less complexity, more peace. He had meant something else entirely. I thought about Arthur's kitchen drawer, about a manila envelope sitting there for 4 months while Arthur waited for me to figure it out. And I thought about the thing Arthur had said when I asked him why he'd kept the letter, why he hadn't confronted Mark himself. "Because it wasn't mine to fix," Arthur had said. "It was yours." The night before the hearing, I could not sleep. This was the clock I had been watching for weeks. The court date, the financial review, the moment when everything would either hold or give way. I lay in the dark in the bedroom, and I thought about 23 years, and I thought about my children, and I thought about what it meant to walk into a room and say, "This is what I am owed." I was up before the light. I made coffee. I sat at the kitchen table in the quiet of early morning, the way I had 1,000 times before, and I thought about who I was before I became Mrs. Calloway of Greenwich, Connecticut, and who I was going to be after. I put on a blazer. It was not wrinkled. The family court hearing was held in a building that had the particular quality of American civic architecture: solid, impersonal, temperature-controlled, too cold, fluorescent lights, the hum of the HVAC, chairs in rows that felt like waiting was the primary activity, as if the waiting itself were part of the process. Arthur was there. I had not asked him to come, but there he was, in one of his 3 suits, sitting in the gallery, with his hands on his knees. Our son had driven down from the city. I had told him not to. He had come anyway. He sat next to Arthur and they nodded at each other in the way men do when they are being deliberately dignified. Mark sat at the other table with Gerald. He had, I noticed, stopped wearing the suit. He was in a sport coat and slacks, softer, less corporate, an attempt perhaps to look less like the man who had been moving assets around behind his wife's back, and more like a regular person who had made some mistakes and was trying to do right. It was a smart read of the room. I gave him that. The judge was a woman in her late 50s, with a manner that suggested she had heard every version of every story at least 3 times and was not going to be impressed by theatrics. She was efficient and direct, and I liked her immediately. What happened in that room was not dramatic, in the cinematic sense. There was no single explosive moment. There was methodical presentation of documents, the equity line of credit, the condo purchase, the attempted trust consolidation, the partnership restructuring timeline. Diane was precise and clear, and I thought, quietly brilliant. Gerald made good arguments. Mark sat very still. Arthur's affidavit was entered into the record. The judge read it with no change in expression. At one point, the judge looked directly at Mark and asked him to clarify the timeline of the equity line of credit withdrawal. He clarified it. The judge looked at the document. She looked back at him. She said nothing else about it, but the quality of her silence said a great deal. The hearing lasted 4 hours. There was a recess. There was more documentation. At the end of it, the judge indicated she would take the matter under advisement and issue a written ruling within 15 days, but she outlined clearly her preliminary view on several key points. The lien on the Greenwich property would need to be resolved as a marital debt before the transfer of title could proceed. The attempted trust consolidation would not stand, as it had been executed without the co-beneficiary's knowledge or consent. The condo transaction would be subject to review as a potential dissipation of marital assets. She said all of this in the measured, level voice of a woman who had decided and was informing the room of the decision. Mark's expression did not change, but Gerald put his pen down on the table in a way that said something. In the hallway afterward, Diane squeezed my arm. She was not a squeegee person. It registered. "That went well," she said quietly. "Our son found me before I reached the exit. He is a serious young man, quiet in the way that runs in that family, and he hugged me for a long moment without saying anything. Then he stepped back and looked at me. 'You okay?' he said. 'Getting there,' I said. 'Grandpa came,' he said, as if I might not have noticed. 'I know,' he nodded. He looked over at where Arthur was putting on his coat at the far end of the hallway. 'He told me on the drive here that you were always the best business decision his son ever made.' He paused. He actually used the word decision. That's how he gives a compliment. I almost laughed. First time in a while. 'That sounds right,' I said. The judge's written ruling came in 12 days, not 15. It was comprehensive and, in the ways that mattered most, clear. The lien on the Greenwich property, the equity line Mark had drawn against our home, was designated a marital debt to be satisfied out of the business assets before the property transferred to me. That meant the house came to me clean, without the debt. The trust Arthur had established remained jointly designated as it had been originally, and my share of it was protected. The condo in Westport, purchased in part with marital funds, was ordered to be sold, with the proceeds allocated according to the marital estate calculation. Mark's partnership restructuring, which had been postponed, proceeded without the asset consolidation he had been pushing for, which meant his position in the firm was renegotiated from a starting point that did not include the advantages he had been positioning for. His partners, I later heard through the ordinary channels of community information, were not particularly gracious about this. They had not appreciated the disruption. Gerald, I was told, sent a handwritten note to Diane. I don't know what it said. Diane mentioned it once briefly and smiled. "Cass, for what it's worth, I don't know about." She sent me one text, and I did not respond. Whatever her story was, it was hers to carry. I had enough to carry. What I carried out of that courthouse on a November day with thin winter light over the parking lot was a settlement order and a property transfer and a woman I was meeting for the first time. She was wearing a blazer that wasn't wrinkled. She was 51 years old. She had an accounting degree she hadn't used in a long time. And she had, somewhere in the middle of the worst year of her life, become someone she actually wanted to be. The house felt different that winter. There's no other way to say it. Mark had formally moved out in October, the hotel giving way to an apartment, a rental, which I privately noted was not the Westport condo. The condo was in the process of being sold. Everything was in process, the way things are when you're on the other side of a legal event, all the pieces still settling into their new configurations. I spent December doing something that surprised me. I reorganized. Not symbolically, not dramatically. I just went room by room and I looked at everything, and I decided what I actually wanted and what had been there because of inertia or obligation or someone else's taste. There was a lot of the third category, more than I expected. I repainted the living room, a deep blue that I had wanted for years and been talked out of. It looked the way I wanted it to look. I put the grandfather clock in the storage unit, because it had been his mother's and it should eventually go to him. But I wasn't ready to see it in my hallway every morning yet. I moved my desk from the small spare room to the room with the west-facing windows. I started thinking about going back to work, not because I needed to, not yet. The settlement had given me financial stability, the house free and clear, and a portion of the marital assets that would, if managed carefully, carry me forward. But because I had been thinking about the accounting degree gathering dust, and about the 6 years I had worked before I stepped back, and about the woman who could catch errors in financial statements that other people missed, that woman had been there the whole time. She had just been doing other things. In January, I called an old colleague from the Stamford firm. She was still there, a partner now. We had coffee. She asked me what I'd been doing for the past 20 years, and I gave her the honest answer, which included everything: the household, the kids, the volunteering, the quiet accounting work I'd done on the side for years just to stay current, the legal navigation of the past 3 months. She listened. She looked at me with a particular expression. "Sarah," she said, "I have been trying to find someone to run the oversight function for our estate planning division for 8 months. I looked at her. "Are you interested?" she said. I thought about Arthur's kitchen table, about the manila envelope, about Diane's conference room, and the judge's level voice, and the lien on the house that was now, cleanly, mine. "Tell me more," I said. "I want to tell you about a Sunday in February. My daughter had come home for the weekend. My son drove down from the city. We were in the kitchen, my kitchen, the one with the deep blue living room visible through the doorway, and I was making pot roast, which takes most of a Sunday but fills the house with something that feels like permanence. My daughter was sitting on the counter the way she had done since she was 12, too tall to actually fit comfortably, too habitual to stop. My son was reading the paper at the table. The house smelled like garlic and rosemary and the specific, complicated warmth of people who belong to each other. At some point my daughter said, out of nowhere, "Mom, are you actually okay?" I considered it. It was the kind of question that deserved a real answer. "I'm more okay than I've been in a long time," I said, "which is strange, because everything looks different." "Different how?" she said. "More mine," I said. She thought about that. She nodded. My son looked up from the paper. He said, "Grandpa called me last week. He wants to come for dinner sometime." "Tell him Sunday," I said. "He'll probably wear one of his 3 suits. I'll wear the blazer," I said. "We'll match." Outside, the maple tree in the backyard stood in the February cold, bare, and absolutely itself, unbothered. I had planted that tree with Mark, 20 years ago, in the optimistic certainty of beginning. It had outlasted things. It had grown through winters I didn't know were coming. It was going to be there in the spring. There is a small thing I keep tucked in my desk drawer, in the room with the west-facing windows. It is the photocopy I made of Arthur's envelope. Not the originals. Just one copy I made for myself, for no legal purpose. Just to have. Just to remember what it looked like when someone you didn't expect believed in you enough to hold something for 4 months and wait for you to be ready. I don't look at it often, but I know it's there. The pot roast filled the house. My daughter talked about her spring semester. My son read the paper. The afternoon light came in from the west the way it does in that room, slow and golden and utterly indifferent to everything that had happened and everything that was coming. I stirred the pot. I thought about the call I'd made on a Wednesday morning in October with a wrinkled navy blouse and shaking hands. That call was the beginning. Not of the end of a life, though it felt that way at the time. The beginning of being the person who makes the call, the person who knows things and acts on what she knows, the person who sits at a table with a manila envelope and decides, quietly, what she is going to do about it. I had not known I was that person. I know it now. And knowing it, that is the thing no settlement order can give you, and no judge can rule on, and no attorney can file in any court. That is the thing that is entirely, irrevocably mine. Thanks for watching until the end. If this story touched you, please subscribe and give this video a thumbs up. As a final reminder, this was a fictional dramatization for entertainment purposes only and does not constitute legal, medical, or financial advice. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. I'll see you in the next story.